Hello, students. This is Module 2.2c. So if you go to Schoology, here's Module 2.2c, and our topic is Robber Baron or Captain of Industry, and we're going to learn what that means in a few moments. You're using this packet, which I have handed out in class, and I'm going to go through the packet with you and talk through these different documents. So our first activity is a do now. And if you take a look, this is called a political cartoon. A political cartoon is a satirical type of a cartoon where it's commenting on a social or political or economic topic. And at this point, it was a current event when this was created. So this was created during the time of the Industrial Revolution. So I'm just going to talk through this visual here. So if you look here, it says Standard Oil. So Standard Oil, which is Rockefeller's company, is the body part is of an octopus. And as you can see, one tentacle is reaching out and it is grabbing the shipping industry. Another tentacle, it has reached out and wrapped itself around Congress. These are the lawmakers. There's one that's starting to reach out and hasn't quite grasped, but is reaching for the White House. Over here, you have another tentacle that is wrapping around the steel and copper industries. You can see an oil tower here, and then another one going around the State House. And the idea here is that this company is acting as an octopus and using its different appendages to grab at or take over different parts of the political and economic life of the United States during the Industrial Revolution. So if you remember from our last lesson, you explored vertical and horizontal integration. And as you may have learned here, John D. Rockefeller used vertical integration. And what that means is he didn't drill for oil, but he bought up all of the oil refineries and he created Standard Oil, which was actually out of Ohio. And so he was a very good businessman. So he bought all the oil refineries. So therefore, he had a monopoly or he dominated all of the oil refineries in the United States that, processed oil for other uses. So now we're going to go ahead and talk through the questions here. And some of these I have already talked through, but I'm going to type as you can take notes and write. Whoops, I need a cursor is what I need. First of all, I need to go out. Let's see, 100%. And I need this. Okay, so as you know, it depicts him as an octopus. He's grabbing Congress, the State House, and reaching for the White House, which means or indicates he's controlling the government. He's also grabbing other industries for his own use in his oil refineries. Very good. I'll go ahead and put some bullet points here. Okay. The second question asks, why is a Standard Oil depicted as an octopus in this case? I'll start off by doing it like this now. So this idea was that he was using unscrupulous or maybe immoral methods to put his competitors out of business. He did this by controlling the government and by controlling industries that he needed for his refineries. All right. Now it says predict whether you think the founder of Standard Oil would be explained as a hero or a villain. So when we look at this picture here, I mean, does this look like a friendly person? Does this look like someone, and you can see he's like got his oil refineries protected under there if we really go ahead and, hone in on this image. These people down here that he's grabbing at in the copper and steel industries, they look angry or defeated or upset. So they don't look happy, right? Um, I don't think that we would think it's a good thing that industry is controlling our government rather than the people since we're a democracy. So um, you have to ultimately decide, is this a positive portrayal of Rockefeller or a negative one? Well, from my little chit chat there, I think we can agree that he's depicted as a villain in this. The eyes on the octopus look greedy, angry, or I'll say aggressive, and he is taking what is not his to take for his use. So that was our first analysis of a political cartoon in this class. We'll be looking at many more. In this era of industrialization, immigration, the progressive era is very rich with political cartoons. So the next activity is a document analysis. So we're going to look at what two speakers say. I'm going to read it and then I'm going to highlight some parts of the text or annotate. So speaker A, they were robber barons. So this speaker is going to say that these industrialists were robber barons, and that this is going to help us understand what a robber baron is. The industrialist robber barons of the late 19th century were predatory and materialistic. Their bloated corporations were threats to the humane and democratic values that made America great. Business tycoons turned modern America, with its standardized life and material cultures, into a place in which Jefferson and Lincoln would be strangers. The giants of industry were primitive souls, ruthless, predatory, capable, single minded men, rogues, and rascals often, but never feeble. So I'm going to break this down for you a little bit, and then we're going to go back to the question on the other page. I've got a nice pen here. Let's go with purple. So again, this is saying that robber barons are predatory and materialistic. Their bloated corporations, or their too big corporation, were threats to democratic and humane values. Threats to democratic values. Business tycoons turned modern America with its standardized life and material into a place that Jefferson and Lincoln would be strangers. This is important to just kind of note because this was within 100 years of their lives, and with Lincoln, a couple of decades. So this goes to show you how rapidly industrialization changed the United States. The giants of industry were primitive souls, ruthless, predatory, capable, single-minded men. They were rogues, rascals often, but never feeble. Feeble means it's the opposite of smart. So someone who's feeble doesn't know better. And what they're saying is these robber barons really knew what they were doing, but they didn't have a conscience. They did not have feel like a moral obligation. So let me go ahead and go back to this, and let's answer this first question. What does Speaker A claim that industrialists of the Gilded Age, or why does the Speaker A complain or claim that industrialists of the Gilded Age were robber barons? What do you think a robber baron is? Let me get my bullet point. So, a robber baron is someone who used ruthless business tactics. They were predatory. They threatened democracy. They were smart. Okay. Um, what do you think a robber baron is? So it's someone who uses ruthless business tactics. So we're kind of answering this in one set here. They were predatory, meaning that they preyed on industries that were not as strong as they or as wealthy, so they could take them over. They threatened democracy because we talked about this a little bit in class because it contributed to campaigns. They were able to control some of our political leaders because if the political leaders didn't support big business, they were no longer going to be elected because they would not have that support during their political campaigns. And again, they were smart. These were people who knew what they were doing and knew how to do it. Okay, let's go back here. And this time, let's use green. All right. So, Speaker B, they were captains of industry. Much of the blame heaped on the captains of industry in the late 19th century is unwarranted. Although people like Rockefeller used methods that were ethically questionable, the kind of monopolistic control that they exercised was a natural response to the cutthroat competition of the period. The captains of industry, like Rockefeller, were innovators, thinkers, planners, and bold entrepreneurs who imposed American industry on more rational and efficient patterns. They also created a model of philanthropy for all to follow. So they say that they're a product of their time, basically, that this is what was going on, and they went with it. So they're innovative thinkers, planners, bold entrepreneurs who imposed upon American rational, effective patterns, and they modeled philanthropy. So, again, this idea that um, they were just part of this culture of being cutthroat. Okay, so let's take a look here. Oops, I put a little bit of a thing on there. So, why does Speaker B claim that industrialists of the Gilded Age, whoopsie, are captains of industry? Mm-hmm. Go here and find here we go. So he says they were innovative, hardworking, a product of their time and circumstances. Have you ever heard strike while the iron is hot? Well, at this time, the iron was hot and they had to take what they could get because it was never going to happen again. And if they didn't grab it, someone else was going to do it. They were thinkers, planners, and philanthropists. If you don't know what a philanthropist is someone who gives money to charity or to different public programs to improve life. So many of our robber barons or captains of industry opened up universities, like you might have heard of Carnegie Mellon University, which was Andrew Carnegie or Vanderbilt. They opened libraries. They had great artistic works that they donated to different museums. So they use their money to enrich the lives of others. So this is where we get into this: were they all good? Were they all bad? Not necessarily, they might have been a little bit of both, but this one's saying that because of their time, this is who they were going to be, but they ultimately benefited us in the United States. So the last question says, compare and contrast the difference between someone who's considered a robber baron or someone who's seen as a captain of industry. So a robber baron is a negative connotation. Um, Again, predatory, ruthless, taking advantage of people. And a captain of industry is positive. Is a positive connotation. This idea that they might have done some things that were questionable, but ultimately it benefited us in the United States. It improved our economy, it improved our way of life, it improved our standing as a nation. All right, next we're going to move on to a text analysis. Now this is teeny tiny print, so I'm actually reading it from a piece of paper here because you know that I can't see things very well. So the text is Industrialists of the Gilded Age, Captains of Industry or Robber Barons. The Gilded Age is a time in American history that runs from the 1870s to 1900s. It takes the name from The Gilded Age, A Tale of Today by Mark Twain, which was a book about the era. Something that is gilded is something that is thinly painted with gold, kind of like a picture frame in a museum. A dirty, old wooden frame painted with a thin layer of gold so it looks extravagant. This may be the perfect metaphor for the era. So, this metaphor of the Gilded Age, something to really kind of understand is that something looks gold, but on the inside it's cheap. So there was this feeling of extravagance that you had these robber barons that were very wealthy, very rich, had these very lavish lifestyles. But kind of, the dirty wooden frame on the inside was that it was a time of political corruption. The working class, the laborers were very poor. Immigrants were very poor. So there wasn't a middle class at this time. How you were born. You were born wealthy or you were born poor, which the masses were poor, was your lot in life. So even though we see in these pictures here, we have these lavish castles that the robber barons lived in. We also see, a crowded room where some people, the laborers, were living. Before the Gilded Age, people worked for themselves. They had their own local business or perfected a family trade. Many were farmers. However, after the Civil War, struggling farmers or tradesmen saw the shift of the United States from an agrarian society into an industrial superpower as an opportunity. Unlike before, industrial jobs were available because of new markets. Now that railroads were depended on, people were needed to build them. Railroads required steel, so steel plants were offering jobs. New technology or an increase in factories meant an increase in the need for oil, so the oil industry skyrocketed. For these reasons, people left their rural homes for cities and began working for somebody else for the first time. Let's go ahead and pause here and go to the first question. So, what was the Gilded Age? How did life change for American workers in the Gilded Age? Let me make this bigger. We need to go up to there we go. So, how did it make it for workers? Let's see, get my thing here. So, gilded equals covered in gold, but cheap inside. And again, this is a comment on that there were very rich and very poor people and political corruption, etc. So, how did American life change? There was unprecedented growth in industry and prosperity. Well, unprecedented, but my goodness, I have a Okay, there we go. Whew, that was a tough one. Again, big business, corrupted politics, and everything looked extravagant. But workers changed because before this, before Gilded Age, farmers and tradesmen, and then after railroads and industry. So the way people work changed. Where they lived changed. Very good. All right, I'm going to go back and read the next couple paragraphs here. So the next paragraph starts with industry leaders, often called captains of industries, provided company housing for these workers. They were also granted a wage, which meant they no longer had to worry about whether or not they'd have money the next day. Captains of industry did not just provide for workers, but they were also philanthropists, meaning they donated millions to charities, nonprofits, libraries, public parks, schools, museums. The footprint of these captains of industry can still be seen in the extravagant public buildings and personal castles and mansions they left behind. So, let's see. Go to this next one here. So, what was a captain of industry and what were some of their accomplishments? So, let's go ahead and put a bullet in there. All right, they were industry leaders. They provided jobs and a living for workers, and they were philanthropists, which meant that they donated money to lots of different things like charities, nonprofits, etc. All right. Back up to the text here. The Gilded Age also had a dark side. Not everyone was living a luxurious life in a palace. Many have chosen to call captains of industry robber barons instead because of their extreme corruption. This is because industrialists dominated the markets by creating monopolies. One example of this is the Standard Oil Company, which eliminated competition, meaning they took out any smaller business that sold oil. So if you wanted to buy oil, you had to get it from them. Once an industrialist had established monopoly like this, they raised the price of their product, and you had no choice but to pay. The same thing happened with the railroad, steel, mining, tobacco, and textile industries. This meant that industrialists were making so much money, they were living better than any king had ever lived. They were more powerful than the president, and few could hold them accountable. All right, so let's go ahead and talk about what a robber baron was. So, a robber baron, again, we know that they were unscrupulous and they took advantage of the public and smaller companies. But these, again, they were industrial leaders. And they dominated the market, monopolies, and they eliminated competition. And they were extremely corrupt in business practices. All right, let's go back and read the next paragraph or the last paragraph. In addition to the corruption, the people working for robber barons experienced harsh working conditions, often working over 12 hours per day without a break, only to go home to a tiny, dirty tenement, which was an old type of rundown apartment that they shared with other families. Industrialists set low wages for workers and never promised them job security. If they went on strike, they lost their jobs. So we will add to this that workers suffered harsh treatment and poor pay at the hands of industrialists. Okay, very good. All right, we're going to bring this document home. It says, how did industrialists establish monopolies over their products and markets? Do you think monopolies are fair? Explain why or why not. Well, they took out competition by buying or closing down smaller businesses. Then they would raise prices because there was no competition. So when they had competition, they kept their prices low because then the other companies, the smaller companies that couldn't keep their prices low, could not compete with them. They had to sell it more expensive in order to make a profit. So once they took out their competition, then they would raise the prices again because there was no competition. So they can charge what they wanted to charge. And you may see this like if you buy something from a local small business, it's going to most likely be more expensive than if you buy it from a, big, you know, uh, franchise of a store. So like buying something from Walmart is going to be much cheaper than if you go to a, locally owned business and buy the same thing because Walmart, because they're so large, they're able to keep prices down. You may have heard like Walmart may not always treat their employees well. They don't unionize or hourly, et cetera, et cetera. But in a smaller business, you may have fewer employees, but they may have better benefits, which also would drive up some of the prices. All right. Do you think that the Gilded Age industrialists were captains of industries or robber barons? So again, you are going to now go ahead and hit pause. And from what we've discussed in this document, what I've read to you, I want you to make a judgment. Were they captains of industry or robber barons? And explain your answer using the evidence that we've discussed in these last questions here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 questions. Go ahead and hit pause and do that. Come back when you're done. All right, activity 3B is text analysis. We're going to take a deeper dive into these robber barons and learn a little bit about each one of them. Okay. So the first one is Andrew Carnegie, steel magnate. Andrew Carnegie was a Scottish-born industrialist in the United States who made a fortune in the steel industry. He maximized profits through ownership of factories, raw material, and transportation infrastructure involved with steelmaking. Carnegie's reputation was damaged by the deadly Homestead strike in 1892 when workers protested against unfair treatment. J.P. Morgan purchased Carnegie Steel Company in 1901 for $480 million, and Carnegie spent the rest of his life as a philanthropist, giving away large quantities of his fortune to libraries, museums, and education. In an essay he wrote called The Gospel of Wealth, Carnegie said, "This was the obligation of the rich and powerful," meaning it was their job when they had lots of money and lots of power to help, to give money away so that other people could have a better life. Okay, so the next one is John D. Rockefeller, founder of Standard Oil. John D. Rockefeller founded the Standard Oil Company. To this day, he remains one of the richest Americans to ever live. When kerosene, which is derived from petroleum and used in lamps, became a necessity, oil became a necessity. Rockefeller ended up monopolizing the oil industry. He wiped out any competitors. So if you wanted oil for your household lights, which was basically everybody, you had to get it from him. In 1890, the U.S. Congress passed the Sherman Antitrust Act, the first federal legislation prohibiting trusts and combinations that restrain trade. Then, to curb Rockefeller's power, Standard Oil was broken up into more than 30 companies. He had shares in each company, though, and he ended up making millions off of this. Rockefeller spent the rest of his life as a philanthropist. So now we have two examples of two captains of industry or robber barons who, once they made their wealth, they found ways to continue to profit off that wealth, but stepped back and gave a lot of their money away to help and to better life for other people. Cornelius Vanderbilt, railroad tycoon. Cornelius Vanderbilt was a self-made millionaire. As a kid, he worked with his dad on a cargo ferry that operated between Staten Island and Manhattan. He learned a lot about cargo and transportation and the steamship industry during these modest early years of his life. In the 1850s, railroads started to become a prominent method of transportation across the United States, and Vanderbilt shifted his interest from the shipping industry to the railroad industry. He bought control of the Hudson River Railroad in 1864, the New York Central Railroad in 1867, the Lakeshore and Michigan Southern Railroad in 1869. In 1870, he consolidated two of his key lines into the New York Central and a Hudson River Railroad, which became one of the first giant corporations in U.S. history. And lastly, J.P. Morgan, financier and banker. John Pierpont Morgan, aka J.P. Morgan, was one of the most powerful bankers of his time. He helped to finance railroads, the U.S. steel industry, and General Electric. Morgan made a fortune by reorganizing and consolidating a bunch of financially troubled railroads. By doing this, he acquired these railroad stocks and ultimately controlled a sixth of American rail lines. Because of his wealth and because there was no central bank in the United States at the time, Morgan was able to save the U.S. from financial disaster on several occasions. In 1895, he saved America's gold standard by loaning the federal government more than $60 million. During a financial crisis in 1907, Morgan held a meeting with the top financiers in the country. He told them which institutions to bail out or financially rescue in order to save the markets. Journalists would later comment that Morgan had too much power and could control the U.S. economy to his own benefit. So for the first question here, it says choose one of the above or industrialists above. How did they become wealthy and what did they do with their wealth? So really, two sentences. Answer how they became wealthy and then what did they wind up doing with their wealth. So take a few moments, hit pause, and answer that question. All right, question number 2. I'll go ahead and model this. So I chose Andrew Carnegie, and he made his money in the steel industry. He profited greatly, and he paid workers little and put down strikes, but he also gave away millions in philanthropic endeavors. Okay, so how did John D. Rockefeller establish a monopoly over the oil industry? He wiped out competition, all oil refineries, and when Standard Oil broke up, he still had the majority of shares and continued to profit greatly. Alrighty, let's take a look at the next one. How did J.P. Morgan use his wealth to save the U.S. economy? Let's go ahead and get a bullet point going here. So J.P. Morgan loaned the U.S. federal government money because there was no central banking system at this time. This really doesn't happen until the Progressive Era, and then later on, as we get to the end of the Great Depression, that also becomes more solidified. He advised government which companies to bail out, and the journalist said perhaps he had too much influence. What do you think? So you decide. So did he have too much control over the government? And do you think the federal government should have intervened to prevent anyone from having that much power? So now you type your opinion here based on those two questions. And again, do you agree or disagree with Andrew Carnegie that the rich and powerful are obligated to be philanthropists? Again, this is your opinion. Go ahead and hit pause to answer these two questions and come back when you're done. And lastly, there is one more opinion question. Which of these men would you label as a captain of industry and which would you label as a robber baron? So choose one and defend which one you would call a captain of industry and why, and which one you would call a robber baron. And then after that, we are done with this investigation, but not quite yet. We will have one more lesson in which we're going to take a deeper dive at another political cartoon and think about this idea of captain of industry or robber baron.